June 2001, Ardoyne, Belfast. People around the world watched as schoolgirls were surrounded by RUC riot police, escorting them as they walked to school past a Protestant housing estate. The residents of the estate stood on the other side of the police barricade, screaming insults at the children and their parents. Over the course of the protests, glass bottles, stones, golf balls, and bags of urine came crashing down around the children. During these few months, the tentative peace that the Good Friday Agreement restored was a far cry from Ardoyne. This is the story of the Holy Cross dispute. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Ardoyne is a district to the north of Belfast City. Steeped in history, Ardoyne actually means Owen's Height, and the name dates back to before the plantation in Ulster occurred. Ardoyne was initially a village, which was founded in 1815 when businessman Michael Andrews moved his factory there, then built housing for employees of the factory in the area. Over the next few decades, more mills sprung up and many people were drawn to the area because of the work prospects. The original factory continued to operate until 1923, before being demolished in 1935 to make way for the Glenard housing estate, as Ardoyne gradually became a part of the ever-expanding sprawl of Belfast City. Historically, Ardoyne has been a majority working-class Catholic area, with a Protestant minority, which shares a border with Crumlin Road to the west. Throughout the Troubles and up until today, Ardoyne has been one of the most deprived areas in Belfast. Many of these areas in Northern Ireland are separated by large peace walls that are about 5.5 metres high. These walls are intended to help prevent the outbreak of violence between different housing estates. Interestingly enough, there were around 18 peace walls in Belfast in the 1990s, but as of writing in 2022, there are significantly more, in the region of 59. And the vast majority of people living on either side of the walls support them remaining. This border between Ardoyne and Crumlin Road is known as an interface area, which is a term used to describe areas where nationalist and unionist residential areas meet and often clash. Ardoyne bears many scars of the Troubles and was one of the worst affected areas, having the highest incidence of sectarian deaths in the region of Northern Ireland. Author Brian McKee explains that, quote, 99 people lost their lives in that square mile. No other community would compare in that within such a small area. So many other people were killed in Ardoyne. British soldiers, RUC officers. People were killed as a result of actions carried out from Ardoyne. It both endured suffering and also inflicted suffering. Though the focus of today's episode happened in 2001, we're going to go back to the onset of the Troubles in 1969. Tensions had been bubbling throughout the 60s in Northern Ireland and culminated with the 1969 Northern Ireland riots. These riots took place between August 12th and 15th, and some consider this to be the beginning of the Troubles. In the city of Derry, the Battle of the Bogside was taking place, in which nationalists squared off against the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC, as well as unionists. Throughout Belfast, the nationalist population faced off against the unionist population. There were many accusations that the RUC, who were meant to be an unbiased police force, actually aided the unionist rioters that night. There are accounts of the RUC not intervening when Protestants started burning down Catholic homes and withdrawing from areas during rioting. An inquiry carried out in 1972, called the Scarman Inquiry, found that the RUC were seriously at fault on at least 6 occasions throughout the rioting, but ultimately concluded, quote, undoubtedly mistakes were made and certain individual officers acted wrongly on occasions. But the general case of a partisan force cooperating with Protestant crowds to attack Catholic people is devoid of substance, and we reject it utterly. The rioting began in Ardoyne on the evening of Thursday, August 14th, with loyalists and nationalists clashing near Holy Cross Catholic Church. During the subsequent 4 days, a large number of people, mainly nationalists, but also some unionists, were intimidated out of their homes, and a number of Catholic houses were set on fire on Brookfield Street. A number of buses were also hijacked and set up as a blockade. Former residents of Ardoyne stated that it was as if all the tensions, fear and anger had exploded and all the sectarian bad blood had come to the surface. Historian Eamon Phoenix writes, quote, "Most of the pressure building up to the night of the 13th to the 16th came from the Loyalists. It was like something from Fiddler on the Roof. All the Catholics were driven out to the edge of the Crumlin Road by the Loyalist WDA, the Woodvale Defence Association, while the Protestants were being forced to relocate into the vacated homes of the Catholics in what was essentially forced displacement." One question that frequently gets asked of the Northern Ireland riots of 1969 is what role did the IRA play in it? The RUC believed that they were facing off against an IRA uprising, but this doesn't appear to be the case. This is 1969, and the IRA had yet to split, but it appears that they were more taken by surprise than anything, offering armed support to defend Catholic areas once the violence had broken out. There were many nationalist civilians who believed that the IRA should have been doing more to protect them and defend nationalist areas, like defending the Catholics in Ardoyne, who were being burned out of their home. This would be a contributing factor in what would eventually lead to the split in the IRA, which would occur later this year, in December, and lead to the formation of the Provisional IRA. During the rioting of 1969, around 300 people were evacuated from Ardoyne, with some Catholic houses set on fire as well. We're going to fast forward a little bit now to August 9th, 1971, when the British Army began Operation Demetrius, which saw the mass arrest and internment of people believed to have connections with the IRA. Dawn raids were launched across Northern Ireland, and 342 people were arrested. The beginning of internment led to 4 days of violence in Northern Ireland that would see 20 civilians, 2 IRA members, and 2 British soldiers killed. It was on that same night, August 9th, where the burning of Ardoyne took place, which saw Protestant families fleeing from Ardoyne and burning down their houses, so that they wouldn't fall into Catholic hands. 194 houses were burned that night. They left their houses and went to Protestant areas, and in many cases moved into the houses that nationalists had been forced out of. As a result of this forced relocation and house burning, around 7,000 Catholics were left homeless, with 2,500 of them fleeing to refugee camps in the Republic of Ireland. And around Belfast, the lines had become significantly more drawn between Protestant and Catholic areas, except for in Ardoyne, as the area had become a bit of a patchwork quilt of Catholic estates and Protestant estates. Over the subsequent 30 years that encompassed the Troubles, many Protestants who could afford to moved away from Belfast and out to the suburbs. Those who were left behind were often poorer, older communities. One such enclave that saw a massive drop in its population was the Protestant housing estate of Glenbryn, which is an estate in the middle of Ardoyne. Since the ceasefires of 1994, Glenbryn's population has gone from more than 3,000 people to just over 900. This decline in the Protestant population can be seen all across Belfast. For example, in 1969, 72,000 people lived in the Greater Shankill area, and by 1996, there were only 20,000. During the course of the Troubles, the population in Glenbryn halved, as locals moved away to more peaceful areas. But some residents of the estate believed that they and their neighbours were being intimidated out by nationalists. And it was this small estate that would become the epicentre for what has become known as the Holy Cross dispute. In the mid-90s, the Provisional IRA, the UDA and the UVF declared a ceasefire. And then with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, it heralded in a tentative end to the violence that had been raging for 30 years. There were many paramilitaries who disagreed with this ceasefire and wanted the violence to continue. These would be known as dissidents, there were dissident Republicans and dissident Loyalists. Despite these ceasefires and the Good Friday Agreement, tensions remained high in Ardoyne. In December 2000, Protestant taxi driver Trevor Kell was shot dead in a suspected IRA attack. The next day, Loyalists shot dead Catholic man Gary Moore. There was always a fear that the wound could reopen and the violence could, once again, spill out onto the streets. But for now it was contained. The Protestant population in Ardoyne felt like they were being targeted by the nationalist population, saying that their homes were being attacked and they were being denied access to facilities in Catholic areas, such as playgrounds and shops. Here's Glenbryn resident Arlene talking about what life was like in her estate.
Petrol bombs, nail bombs, glass bombs, battles, bricks, just anything, nuts and bolts was found. Just anything that they got their hands on to throw over.
Anne Bill, a community worker who worked in the area, had this to say, quote, "Community relations throughout all of Northern Ireland took a step backward because Protestants believed they weren't getting a fair deal under the Good Friday Agreement. People in Glenbryn kept telling the government about attacks on their houses and how vulnerable they felt, but we weren't being listened to." This brings us to Holy Cross School, which is a Catholic girls' school located at the top of the Ardoyne Road, which has been open there since 1969. With the onset of the violence and the Troubles over the next 30 years, the sectarian divide deepened. And with Catholics and Protestants relocating, the school soon became cut off. With the majority of its Catholic pupils living at the bottom of the road. A 200-metre stretch of road separated the students from their school, which was a short 5-minute walk away. But they would have to walk past the Protestant Glenbryn estate just to get to school, something which the residents were not happy with. It's hard to know the truth behind what kicked things off, but the main story, which is claimed by Loyalists and denied by Republicans, centres around a flag. The story put forward is that Loyalists were putting up UDA flags, which are flags for the Loyalist paramilitary group, the Ulster Defence Association, when a car came up from Ardoyne and rammed into the ladder that they were using to put up the flags. Here's Jim McLean explaining what happened on the night.
One of the youths threw up a ladder with a flag. I heard this like a car revving up. I looked behind me. He pulled up the pavement and tried to knock me and the other two down, and just missed this lamppost. Took off at speed, dropped the youth off just behind you there, and then handbraked the car and came back down. We were standing just about here to the right, sort of way protecting ourselves behind the lamppost, and he mounted the footpath once again and pulled into the street just behind me. So we started running back up this way.
Loyalists then decided to take action, as they were sick and tired of this feeling of being surrounded by the Catholic community. So they focused their effort and attention on the one thing they saw every day: parents walking their daughters to school outside their windows. They decided that they would do everything in their power to stop the families walking by their estate. On June the 19th, 2001, the RUC had to protect parents and children as they walked to school. The following day, Loyalists formed a blockade, claiming that members of the IRA were walking to school with the schoolgirls and gathering intel on the Protestants in the estate. They successfully prevented students from getting to the school, forcing the school to close. Here's one parent talking about what it was like walking to school by the protesters.
They were calling our children fiending scum. I mean, you've seen children with spittle running down their faces. These are grown men and women, calling young children and their parents scum and big ears and fatso. And, I honestly, it is raw, naked sectarian hate.
The protesters claimed that there was an alternative entrance to the school, which the families could take and would not pass by their estate. But many parents refused to use it, saying why should they have to use the back door, implying second-class citizenship and comparing it to the racial segregation of the USA in the 1950s. Some parents also believed that if they ceded this ground to Unionists, they would never get it back. The secondary route was across another school's football field and could get so muddy that cars would get stuck in the mud. In its current form, it was not suitable as an alternative entrance. Here's resident Stuart McCarthy talking about the issue.
Conditions are atrocious. You can see there and you get stuck in the car coming up through the mud. You're coming through mud across another school's football pitch.
That evening, clashes occurred between loyalists, nationalists and the RUC. Shots were fired at the police and a large amount of petrol bombs were thrown, with both nationalists and loyalists claiming that the other side had instigated the violence. On June 21st, the protests continued and only about 60 of the school's 230 students made it to school, coming in through the side entrance. That night, the protesting turned more violent and there were more shots fired by paramilitary groups, as well as petrol bomb attacks on members of the RUC. 2 pipe bombs were also thrown at Catholic homes. With no end to the barricades and protesting, and with the summer holidays just around the corner, Holy Cross School closed their doors early on Friday, June 22nd, with the hope that the issue would be resolved after the summer holiday, in September. Unfortunately, things would have to get a lot worse before they would get better. During the summer break, the residents of Glenbryn organised under the acronym CRUA, which meant Concerned Residents of Upper Ardoyne. The students and parents also organised under their own acronym, RTE, which stood for Right to Education. Throughout the summer, the violence would continue. July 12th is a significant date for Unionists, as it is the day that celebrates the victory of Protestant King William of Orange over Catholic King James II at the Battle of the Boyne. There are usually small outbreaks of violence or scuffles in Northern Ireland on this date, or the eve of. But July 12th, 2001 was the largest rioting that had been seen in Northern Ireland in years. Part of the day's celebrations would see a parade of 100 Orange men, who are a fraternal unionist organisation, march through the nationalist part of Ardoyne, which naturally upset the nationalists. The RUC were attacked as they protected the Orange men passing through the area, and rioting broke out which lasted over 7 hours. In preparation for the new school term to start, the RUC was faced with a difficult decision. They knew that the Glenbryn residents would be protesting the schoolgirls and their parents. If they forcibly shut down these protests, that would further enrage the loyalist community and could escalate things. But they also had to allow the children to get to school. A decision was made to allow the protesting to continue, but to also facilitate the children to get to school. This would take the form of many RUC officers and some British Army members in full riot gear, creating a human barricade on either side of the Ardoyne Road, so that the parents and school children could walk to school without being blocked by protesters. It was an incredibly expensive operation, and at one point, over 1/8 of Belfast's entire police force was out there to help protect the children. School resumed on Monday, September 3rd, 2001. The RUC were better prepared, but so were the protesters, and there was a large crowd of them pushing back against the barricades, shouting abuse at the parents and children. And it was this week where some of the most visual and unique imagery of the Troubles has been captured. Schoolgirls as young as 5 years old, dressed neatly, with black shoes on, red socks, and a bright red jumper, clutching their parents' hands and leaning into them as they hurried past the police standing on either side of them with riot shields. With a crowd behind the shields, screaming at the parents and the children. Some children were crying, and screaming in fear. And some parents were holding their hands over the children's eyes or ears. The crowd were shouting insults, hurling stones, golf balls, and in one case a bag of urine at the parents and schoolgirls. There was also a fairly large media presence there, with cameras capturing the entire event and broadcasting it all over the world. It's an image that is reminiscent of African American children trying to get to school in the USA in the 1950s, and really hadn't been seen to such an extent in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. One mother recalls, quote, "It was absolutely terrifying. They were shouting, 'Dirty tramps, your kids are animals, Fenian scum, you Fenian bastards,' and all we were trying to do was get our kids to school." Just a quick note for anyone who is unaware, Fenian is a term that loyalists used against the nationalist population in a derogatory manner. Unionist politicians argued that the RUC were too heavy-handed and antagonised the crowd of loyalists. Billy Hutchinson, who was a unionist politician and member of the Progressive Unionist Party, which is a political party aligned with the paramilitary UVF, claimed that there were at least 5 IRA members in the crowd walking to school. Here's Hutchinson talking about the police response.
What we've got this morning is the RUC pushing people up here. Not only children and adults going to school, but also senior Republicans. And they were allowed to go up, they were allowed to abuse this community, and the police didn't turn on them. They turned on the Protestant community.
That week, a warning was then issued by the Red Hand Defenders, who were a loyalist paramilitary group, warning parents to stay away from the Ardoyne Road. Day after day, the children continued to walk to school with their parents and the RUC barricade between them and the protesters. Things took a more serious turn on September 5th, when a blast bomb was thrown towards the parents and girls. The explosion and subsequent chaos was caught on camera.
Dirty bastards!
Here's 9-year-old Shannon talking about that moment.
All you heard is a big bang and people screaming, and then everybody started running off for the school. And when everybody got into school, they were in hysterics and all, and they were just like that, and they didn't want to come into school, and they wanted to go back down home.
The bomb exploded and injured 4 RUC officers. Billy Hutchinson said that he was, quote, "ashamed to be a loyalist today after seeing these people attack young Catholic girls." Though Hutchinson said this, he did continue to stand with the protesters every day, and wrote in his recent autobiography that he had to be there because they were his constituents and he had to help defuse the situation and, quote, "help the local loyalists formulate a peaceful means of protesting." Hutchinson wrote of the protests that they were, quote, "totally counterproductive and portrayed loyalism as backward and nasty in the eyes of the world." There was an argument amongst some protesters that it was the police traumatising the children and not them.
The thing is, if there's less police on the roads, it weakens the trauma to the children, it weakens their argument.
They're not interested in weakening the trauma for their children. Don't forget, it's all to them. It's about as much trauma they can cause. It betters their cause, as far as they're concerned.
The following day, Thursday, September 6th, there was no violence, but the protesters used air horns, whistles and bin lids to make as much noise as possible. Also, some Catholic parents were told that death threats had been issued against them. On September 9th, the protests continued but were silent, this time as a mark of respect to 16-year-old Protestant Thomas MacDonald, who had been killed in a hit and run after he attacked a car with bricks and stones. The protesting continued into week 2, and on Friday, September 14th, the protesters were silent as a mark of respect for the victims of the 9/11 attacks which had just occurred in the USA. After 9/11, a lot of the international press who had been covering the dispute left Ardoyne for America. I often talk about PR when it comes to paramilitary groups, and what they deemed to be good PR and bad PR. And from a PR perspective, the Holy Cross dispute was a disaster for both loyalism and unionism. Images and videos were broadcast around the world, depicting them shouting and screaming abuse at children. Unionists believed that the world media was sympathetic to nationalists to begin with, so the news coverage they received couldn't possibly be unbiased. Ex-President of the Republic of Ireland, Mary McAleese, is from Ardoyne and said of the global coverage, quote, "These people actually thought at the start of it that they had a good story to tell. It was only as events went on they realised they were being vilified, and rightly so, right around the world. Now that should have woken them up to the reality, but for some of them it didn't. It just made them feel more a sense of victimhood." Andy Cooper is a resident of Hesketh Park, which is a Protestant housing estate which sits on the Ardoyne Road. Here he is talking about the narrative of the dispute.
I believe for them it's about territory. For the protesters here, it's about conflict on the Ardoyne Road. It's about conflict that little children from the ages of 4 to 11 years of age, both Protestant and Catholic, are being drawn into. And they're being drawn into it by a Republican element that wants to use the Holy Cross school.
Andy also goes on to talk about putting children in front of cameras for the world media.
I'll not bring my child in front of a TV camera because I don't believe it's in his best interest to do that there. And the one thing that concerns me is how people can put their children in front of television cameras, to have them used. Oh, this is the problems. Oh, my child's suffering. All children should never suffer, no matter what religion they are. But our children are suffering too.
Days of protesting soon turned into weeks, and day after day, schoolgirls and their parents walked by these angry protesters, who were held back by the RUC. There were some periods of quiet, and sometimes the protests would gradually increase in their intensity. On the fourth week, on Wednesday, September 26th, fireworks were thrown at the parents and children as they returned home from school. On the fifth week, urine-filled balloons and cold cups of tea and water were thrown at the parents and children. On the sixth week, the protesters began hiding their identities and wearing masks of characters from horror movies. All the while, both sides were quite surprised at the inaction of the political groups in Northern Ireland, who seemed to be doing very little to resolve this situation. On the seventh week, Bryce Dickinson, the head of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, visited and said, quote, "The treatment of these children is inhumane and their right to effective education is being affected." That same week, a bomb also exploded on the nearby Alliance Avenue, injuring the homeowner and shocking some parents and children. October turned into November without any resolution. On November 7th, Bishop Desmond Tutu visited the children and protesters and talked with both sides.
All of us around the world have been very distressed at what's been happening here, especially that although there may be reasons on all sides, it's such a distressing feature of it all that the children have been pawns.
As November was drawing to a close, Crua, the group set up to protest against those walking to school, had split up, with some of the members resigning. First Minister David Trimble and Deputy First Minister Mark Durkan called for an end to the protests and met with the protest group on November 22nd to hear their demands. They wanted CCTV introduced to the area, road camming measures taken, and tighter security. Trimble tabled a deal, asking them to stop the protesting, and in return they would increase security in the area. The group announced a suspension of protests the following day, on November 23rd, after 11 continuous weeks of protesting. One person who was very important throughout these walks to school over the 11-week period was Father Aidan Troy, who was a Catholic priest and chair of Holy Cross. He walked with the parents and children every day through the barricade, and many protesters targeted him specifically, accusing him of being a paedophile. And I've seen one account that mentioned that the bishops higher up were upset that he was being this vocal about the issue. In the months after the official end to the protest, British Army armoured vehicles sat outside the school, but soon enough parents could walk to the school without police escort. Though things did flare up again in early 2002, for the most part, the protesting against school children was not coming back. Mary McAleese explains it well, saying, quote, "Ardoyne is still very knotted, and the knot of sectarianism is pulled tight, and it needs to be loosened. Because a lot of this stuff, came out of a sense of hopelessness, being left behind, being overlooked, and then neglected, and then taking it out on the wrong people." A month before the protest ended, the Department of Social Protection launched a housing redevelopment package for Glenbryn. This upset some nationalists, as 80% of the people on the social housing list were nationalists. Some claimed that this was a buy-off for the Glenbryn residents, and that their protesting was being rewarded. But the Glenbryn residents weren't happy either, with one activist saying that 186 houses were to be razed, and only 20% built back up, thus shrinking the Protestant population even further. But most importantly, what became of the children in this episode? For the schoolgirls at the centre of the episode, there is no doubt that many were left traumatised by the dispute. Many required counselling, and some required long-term therapy. Some also left Holy Cross School for a different school. Like I mentioned earlier, Mary McAleese, who was the President of Ireland at the time, was from Ardoyne, and this issue was very close to her heart. She invited the schoolgirls to Áras an Uachtaráin, which is the residence of the Irish President, to, quote, make them feel like they were a part of a bigger picture, like they were not alone. She also invited residents of Glenbryn to an event there on a different date, so that they could talk through their grievances. McAleese understood that both sides needed to be respected. In 2016, the Belfast Telegraph revealed that there were 8 applications for compensation lodged with the Department of Justice by families of the school children. As of 2016, 3 of those had been paid out. The amount has not been revealed, but it could range anywhere between £1,000 and £250,000. Many experts on the Troubles and figures within the media have claimed that it was this incident that would give loyalism a mortal wound to their image on the global stage. BBC correspondent Gareth Gordon wrote of the period, quote, "Whatever the rights and wrongs of the cause which began this form of protest, it was lost in the terrified faces of the girls forced to suffer a school run like no other." I leave the last word to Holy Cross student Shannon, who was 9 at the time of the dispute. When asked how she felt about the protesters, she had this to say: "Thanks, and see you next time."
They don't really know what they're doing, and they don't really know what they're saying, but I know they don't mean it. But whatever they do, I'll always forgive them.
So again, folks, I just want to take this time to thank you all for listening to the podcast. I hope you're enjoying the podcast and I hope you're finding it very informative. These episodes take a long time to research, write and prepare. So if you do want to support the podcast, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. There's a number of different tiers there, and as well as that I put up a lot of media related to the episodes, including reading lists, and I also release a Troubles companion video after every episode I release here. If you'd like to support the podcast in a different way, you can also do so at buymeacoffee.com/The Troubles Podcast. There you can buy me a virtual coffee, which is very appreciated. And if you'd like to support the podcast in a non-financial way, please leave a review or simply tell your friends. Each and every recommendation helps. That's it from me. Thanks again for your support.